Gravity Falls opens with a moment most people forget to think about twice. 12-year-old Dipper Pines is riding his bike through the woods behind his great-uncle's tourist trap, and he almost runs over something buried in the dirt. He stops, he digs it out. It is a leather-bound book with a golden six-fingered hand stamped into the cover and a big black number 3 on the spine. And inside it is page after page of warnings, monster sketches, and a scrawled message that starts with the word "trust no one." He does not know it yet, but that single found object is going to reorganize his entire summer, and honestly, his entire life. Almost nobody talks about what that scene is actually doing underneath the monster reveal. It is not just planting a mystery box, it is handing a lonely, overlooked kid the one thing he has always wanted, which is proof. Proof that the world is stranger and more meaningful than the adults around him are willing to admit. Tonight we are going through the philosophy of every character in Gravity Falls, one by one, from the twins at the center all the way out to the throwaway gnomes and the sheriff who never quite notices anything. And by the end, we are going to end up somewhere much stranger and sadder than a kid's cartoon has any right to take us. This is Pine Hat, so get comfortable, we will be here a while, and if you have not subscribed yet, it really does help us keep making these. Here's the thing about Gravity Falls that people tend to say once and then never really sit with. It ran for 2 seasons, 40 episodes from 2012 to 2016, and it looks, on the surface, like a summer cartoon about a golf cart chase and a boy who is convinced the town gnomes are up to something. But structurally, almost every character in it is built around the same 3 fault lines over and over in different costumes. Truth against comfortable illusion, family against self-interest, control against chaos. Dipper wants truth so badly it costs him his own credibility. Mabel chooses illusion, sometimes knowingly, because the truth keeps taking things from her, and she has decided joy is worth defending anyway. Stan builds an entire life on lies to protect the people he loves, which sounds like a contradiction until you actually watch what he lies about. Ford chases pure knowledge until it nearly ends the world. And Bill Cipher, who we will spend a long stretch of tonight on, is the one figure in the whole show who has picked chaos over everything else. With no attachment to family, no interest in truth for its own sake, just the pure appetite for unmaking things. Every single character we are going to talk about tonight fits somewhere on that grid. Some of them fit on it by accident, some of them are built specifically to test it, and 1 or 2 of them, mostly the very small ones, get maybe 15 seconds of screen time and still manage to say something true about it. That is the through line. Keep it in your head as we go, because it is going to keep resurfacing in places you would not expect. A sheriff who refuses to see, a bear who just wants somewhere to belong, a demon who is furious that flat, 2-dimensional creatures like the ones he came from could ever be considered less real than anyone else. But we start where the story starts, with the twins. Dipper Pines is the character the show hands its investigative energy to, and if you strip away the flannel and the pine tree hat and the summer camp premise, what you actually have is a kid who has built his entire identity around being right. Not liking being right, needing it. From the moment he pulls journal number 3 out of the dirt, Dipper is not just curious about the supernatural, he is desperate for it to be real. Because if it is real, then he is not the paranoid, anxious kid who overthinks everything. He is the one person in Gravity Falls who is paying close enough attention to notice. That is an appealing shift for a 12-year-old to make, and it is smart enough to let us feel how appealing it is before it starts showing us the cost. Because there is a cost, and it shows up almost immediately. Dipper spends huge stretches of the first season trying to get someone, anyone, to believe him. His sister mostly humors him. His great-uncle Stan treats the whole supernatural angle as either a nuisance or, later, something to actively suppress, for reasons Dipper cannot yet understand. And so Dipper's relationship to the truth becomes less about curiosity and more about vindication. He is not just trying to find out what a gnome is or why the vending machine in the shack has a secret door behind it. He is trying to prove that his way of seeing the world, the careful, skeptical, note-taking way, is the correct way, against a town that mostly shrugs and moves on. The show frames this sympathetically. Dipper's likable specifically because his obsession comes from a decent place, from wanting to matter, from wanting his attention to detail, to count for something in a family where his sister gets noticed for being fun, and he does not always get noticed for anything at all. But it is worth being honest about what that need curdles into by the back half of the run. There are stretches where Dipper's hunger to be the one who knows, the one with the answer, starts to look less like curiosity and more like control. He wants the journal to keep giving him power over situations he cannot otherwise manage. He wants to be the expert, and Gravity Falls quietly punishes that impulse more than once, not cruelly but consistently, by having his certainty turn out to be incomplete or his research turn out to miss the human cost of what he is chasing. This is worth pausing on because I think it is one of the most underrated pieces of characterization in the entire show. Dipper Pines is the closest thing Gravity Falls has to a philosophical empiricist. He believes in evidence. He believes that if you write it down, cross-reference it, test it against what actually happens, you can arrive at something solid enough to stand on. And it does not mock that instinct. Not really. It is generally rewarded. It is usually Dipper's carefulness that keeps the group alive when things go wrong. But the story also keeps showing him situations where evidence is not the whole picture, where the correct answer to a mystery does not actually tell you what to do about the people involved in it. Being right about what something is turns out to be a completely different skill from knowing what to do once you know it. That gap between knowing and caring is going to come back later tonight when we talk about his great-uncle Ford, because Ford is basically what happens when you take Dipper's exact temperament and let it run, unsupervised, for 30 years. Dipper is the early sketch of a mind that trusts data over people. Ford is the finished, much sadder painting of the same idea. Now put Mabel next to him because the contrast is the whole point. Mabel Pines does not need to be right. She does not particularly care whether the world makes sense. What she cares about is whether the day in front of her can be made good right now with whatever she has on hand, which is usually glitter, a sweater she made herself, and an enthusiasm that does not seem to require external permission to exist. If Dipper's whole philosophy is built around evidence, Mabel's is built around a kind of chosen, stubborn optimism that functions almost like a moral stance rather than a personality quirk. And I want to be careful here because it would be easy to read Mabel as simply the fun one, the comic relief twin, the one who provides emotional warmth while her brother does the actual thinking. That is a real undersell of what the show is doing with her. Mabel's optimism is not naive. It is a strategy, and a fairly sophisticated one, for surviving a summer and eventually a childhood that keeps handing her losses, relationships that do not work out, a brother who is increasingly consumed by his own obsessions, a town full of adults who mostly do not take her seriously because she is loud and bright and unashamed of liking what she likes. Mabel's response to all of that is not denial. She sees the losses clearly, arguably more clearly than Dipper does at times, because she is not busy trying to prove anything to anyone. Her response is to decide actively and repeatedly that joy is worth choosing anyway, on purpose, as a kind of daily practice rather than a default setting. That is closer to existentialism than people usually give a kid's show credit for engaging with. The classic existentialist move is not to deny that the world can be absurd, indifferent, or painful. It is to insist that meaning has to be built by the person living inside it, because it certainly is not coming from outside. Mabel builds meaning constantly, out of almost nothing. A sweater, a held hand, a ridiculous scheme to fix a friend's broken heart in an afternoon. None of it is naive, all of it is chosen, and I think that is the actual argument Gravity Falls is making about her. That her sunniness is not a lack of understanding, it is a considered response to an understanding she has already fully absorbed. She knows the summer is going to end. She knows, on some level long before Dipper articulates it, that this is the last stretch of childhood either of them is going to get. And her answer to that knowledge is not to grip tighter or dig for more information the way her brother does. Her answer is to spend the time that is left being as fully, embarrassingly, gloriously present in it as she can manage. So here's where I actually want to land on these two, because I think it is more interesting than just calling them opposites, which is the easy read and the one most people stop at. Dipper and Mabel are not opposing philosophies bolted onto two kids for comic contrast. They are two different coping strategies aimed at exactly the same underlying problem, which is that they are growing up, and growing up is happening to them faster than either of them wants, and neither of them has any actual control over it. Dipper's strategy is to try to understand it. If he can gather enough evidence, catalog enough of the strange things happening around him, maybe he can get ahead of the uncertainty. Maybe knowing will feel like a kind of safety. Mabel's strategy is to accept that she cannot control any of it. and to focus instead on making sure that whatever time she has is spent feeling something real, rather than spent trying to pin the real thing down first. Neither strategy actually stops the summer from ending. That is the quietly devastating part in the series never says out loud, but keeps circling. All that research, all that joy, none of it stops the season from turning. None of it keeps them 12 forever. But the two strategies do produce two very different kinds of person by the time Weirdmageddon arrives. And Gravity Falls is honest enough to put both of them under real pressure and let each come up a little short in different ways. Before, together, they come up with enough. It is also worth saying, because this is the kind of detail that gets lost once people start treating Gravity Falls purely as a mystery box show, that journal number 3 is the object that splits them into these two paths in the first place. Before Dipper finds it, they are just twins on a forced summer vacation with an uncle who runs a rundown tourist trap. The book gives Dipper something to organize his attention around, a body of evidence to expand and defend, a reason to trust his own instincts over the town's polite disinterest. Mabel gets no such object. She does not need one. Her worldview does not require a text to validate it, which, if you think about it for a second, is itself a kind of quiet commentary on the difference between them. Dipper needs a document to feel sure of what he knows. Mabel just decides. None of this means Gravity Falls picks a side, and this is the part I actually find myself arguing with people about. Because there is a temptation to read the series as ultimately vindicating Mabel's approach over Dipper's, since her chapters tend to land on warmth and his tend to land on complications. I do not think that is quite right, and I do not think the writers want us to think that either. Dipper's skepticism, his refusal to let something slide just because it is more comfortable to let it slide, is exactly what eventually gets them close enough to the truth about their family to understand what is happening around them. Without his stubbornness, nobody figures out what Stan is hiding, nobody finds the second journal, nobody makes it far enough into the mystery to matter. Mabel's optimism, meanwhile, is exactly what keeps the emotional core of the family together while Dipper is busy chasing evidence. It is what actually holds Stan accountable in ways that facts alone cannot. Because Stan does not respond to being caught, he responds to being loved anyway. So what the series is actually proposing, if you squint at these two philosophies side by side, is that you need both. The empiricist and the optimist. The one who insists on knowing and the one who insists on feeling. Alone, either one curdles. Dipper into isolation and control, Mabel into denial dressed up as cheer. Together, in the same house, on the same summer, they cover each other's blind spots almost without noticing they are doing it. And that, more than any single mystery or cipher or monster of the week, is what the twins are actually for. They are the demonstration right at the front of the series, before anyone even mentions Stan's secrets or Bill Cipher's name, that growing up is not a problem you solve with one correct approach. It takes both of theirs. Keep that in mind, because everyone else we are about to talk about tonight, the con man uncle, the obsessive scientist brother, the loyal handyman, the demon made of pure chaos, is going to be measured against some version of the same split between wanting to know and choosing to feel. And almost none of them are going to manage the balance the twins eventually find. Grunkle Stan runs a tourist trap out of an old house in the woods, and he runs it the way a certain kind of man runs everything, by charging people money for things that are not quite true. The Mystery Shack sells shrunken heads that are rubber, a jackalope stapled together in the back room, a gift shop full of souvenirs marked up past any reasonable price, and Stan stands in front of all of it in a suit and a fez, narrating wonders that do not exist, because that is the job, and because it becomes clear fairly early on that is also who he is. Gravity Falls introduces him as a con man before it introduces him as anything else, and it never really walks that back. He overcharges, he exaggerates, he invents backstories for his exhibits on the spot. He treats honesty as a tool you use only when it is the more profitable option. That is Stan's stated philosophy. If you asked him directly, he would probably tell you the whole world is a con and the only sin is doing it badly. But here's the thing the series keeps circling back to, gently, without ever announcing it outright, which is that there are two totally different kinds of lying happening inside that one man, and only one of them is actually about money. There is Stan the huckster, who lies for a living, who will tell a busload of tourists that a normal rock is a piece of a meteor if it gets them to open their wallets. And that kind of lying is basically harmless. It is a performance both sides silently agree to. The tourists know on some level they are being had, and they pay for the fun of being had anyway. And then there is Stan the man, underneath the fez, who has been lying about something enormous for 3 decades to the entire town, and eventually to his own grandniece and grandnephew. And that lie is not a performance anyone agreed to. Nobody bought a ticket for that one. That lie is not a con. It is a wound that has scarred over so completely it now looks, from the outside, exactly like his personality. This distinction is worth pausing on because it is easy to watch Gravity Falls as a kid and just file Stan under funny, cheapskate uncle. And it is easy to watch it again as an adult and file him under sad, tragic liar. And the truth the show is actually building toward is that he is both at once, and that the small lies and the big lie come from the exact same place. Stan learned somewhere along the way that the truth does not protect the people he loves, that being honest gets you nothing, that the world rewards the version of yourself you can perform rather than the version you actually are. So he performs. Being fine is one performance. Being comfortable, or at least solvent, when the mystery shack is barely staying afloat some seasons, is another. And being gruff and unbothered by anything, when the story quietly demonstrates over and over that he is bothered by nearly everything, especially anything involving the 2 kids he is supposedly only babysitting for a summer, is a third. The con on the tourists is the small, harmless version of a much bigger habit. Stan cons people because at some point lying was the only tool he had that actually worked. Alex Hirsch has said in interviews that Stan is drawn very directly from his own grandfather, also named Stan, a man Hirsch has described as someone who told tall tales and loved needling the family just to get a rise out of them. That detail matters more than it might seem to on the surface because it tells you exactly how this character was meant to land. He was not built in a writer's room as a stock archetype of the shifty carnival barker. He was built out of somebody's actual memory of a real relative, somebody who annoyed you and delighted you in the same breath, whose lies you learned to read as a kind of affection because that was simply how he expressed himself. That is why Stan lands the way he does across the whole series, why audiences forgive him things that, written coldly on a page, look genuinely bad. A man who deceived children for years about their own family history should, by most reasonable measures, be a difficult character to root for. But Gravity Falls never asked you to root for the con man in the abstract. It asked you to root for somebody's grandfather, filtered through Hirsch's own memory of his, and that filter is doing an enormous amount of quiet work underneath every joke Stan makes. Here is where the con and the wound finally merge into a single thesis. The show eventually reveals, and this is one of its most carefully protected reveals, that Stan spent 30 years lying to the entire town of Gravity Falls, and to Dipper and Mabel specifically, in order to protect a secret buried underneath the mystery shack. That secret is a portal, and the man who built it and then vanished into it. An entire version of events Stan spent decades keeping hidden even from his own family. This is not a small deception maintained for convenience. 30 years is most of an adult life, long enough that a lie stops feeling like a lie from the inside and becomes the operating system instead, the story you reach for before you reach for the truth. The argument the series seems to be making with that scale of concealment is a genuinely uncomfortable one once you look at it directly. For Stan, love and secrecy were never in conflict. They were the same behavior. He did not lie to Dipper and Mabel instead of loving them. He lied to them because he loved someone or something enough to spend 30 years guarding it. And once that pattern set in, it simply extended to cover everyone else who mattered to him, including 2 kids who showed up one summer and became, without either side quite noticing it happen, people he needed to protect the same way. That is a strange kind of thesis for a family cartoon to be running quietly underneath all its jokes about grappling hooks and gnomes. The idea that concealment can be a love language, that some of the people who protect you hardest are the ones telling you the least. It is not a comfortable idea, and Gravity Falls does not pretend it is. Dipper in particular spends a real portion of the series feeling betrayed by exactly this, by the discovery that the adult supposedly responsible for him has been managing a decades-long cover story the whole time. That anger is treated as completely legitimate. Stan is not let off the hook just because his intentions were tender underneath. The story makes you sit with the fact that intentions and impact are different things, that a man can be protecting someone out of real love and still be doing real damage to their trust in him at the same time. That tension, more than any single scene, is what Stan's philosophy actually resolves into by the time the story is finished with him. Not lying equals bad, not lying equals love, but lying can be both, frequently in the same breath, from the same person, for the same reason. There is a smaller detail buried in Stan's backstory that tends to get less attention than the portal itself, and it deserves more than it gets because it is some of the clearest evidence Gravity Falls gives you that Stan's motives were never simply about money, even though money is the language he speaks in almost every other context. By most fan accounts, Stan spent years quietly keeping up the payments on Ford's old house. The same house that sat on top of the portal, the same house he needed to keep control of in order to keep the secret buried underneath it contained. Think about what that means as a piece of behavior from a man otherwise presented as constantly broke, constantly scheming for another dollar, constantly running a gift shop that oversells everything at triple its worth. Here is that same man pouring money he clearly does not have to spare into keeping a building standing, not to profit from it, not to sell it, not even really to live comfortably in it, but specifically to maintain access to a secret he could just as easily have walked away from. If Stan were purely the greedy hustler the surface of his character suggests, the rational move is obvious. Sell the house, cut the losses, move on with his life. He does not do that. He spends years of his own limited resources anchoring himself to a building that exists, as far as anyone else can tell, purely as a burden. That is not the behavior of a con man protecting an asset. That is the behavior of a man protecting a memory or a promise or a brother, even one he will not admit out loud he is still thinking about. Gravity Falls eventually gives you the full account of why, in an episode fans generally regard as one of the heaviest in the whole series, A Tale of Two Stan, which lays out the history between Stan and his twin brother, the fight that ended with one of them disappearing, and the 30 years Stan spent afterward maintaining the lie that kept the truth buried. That episode is really the other twin's story to earn in full. The portal, the disappearance, the guilt, all of it belongs more properly to a later part of this essay when we get to Stanford directly, and walking through it scene by scene here would be doing that chapter's job early and badly. What matters for Stan's philosophy specifically is what that episode confirms about the shape of everything already circling underneath this one. The years of silence, the elaborate story Stan maintained even in front of his own great-niece and great-nephew, all of it traces back to one single, very human motive. Stan lost someone he loved, blamed himself for it in ways he never said out loud to anyone, and built an entire adult life, an entire persona, an entire tourist trap gift shop economy on top of trying to keep that loss from becoming permanent. The con man routine is not separate from that grief. It is the shape grief took when it had nowhere honest to go. And that is really the whole answer to what Stan's philosophy comes down to once you strip away the fez, the cane, and the whole shabby showman routine. Stan is somebody who learned to con everyone around him because at some point the truth cost him the person he cared about most, and lying, however imperfect, however corrosive, felt like the only way to hold on to what was left. He cons the tourist for pocket change, and that part is almost a relief to watch. It is low stakes, it is funny, it is the version of Stan that costs nobody anything real. But the same instinct that makes him overcharge a family of 4 for some trinket he swears is a gnome's toenail is the instinct that made him spend 30 years telling 2 children and an entire town a story that was not true because the true version was unbearable. And he had decided somewhere along the way that unbearable things do not get spoken. They get buried, preferably under a gift shop, preferably under a fez, preferably under a whole personality built specifically so nobody would ever think to ask what was underneath it. If Stan's philosophy is the con that finally becomes honest, Ford's philosophy is almost the exact inversion of that shape. Stanford Pines does not lie for a living. He does not need to. He tells the truth constantly, compulsively, at length, in 6 languages if you let him. And the tragedy of his character is that telling the truth was never actually his problem. His problem was that he trusted his own conclusions more than he trusted anyone standing in front of him. And Gravity Falls spends its entire run quietly building the case that this, not deception, is the more dangerous habit of mind. Ford is introduced to the audience gradually in pieces the way a buried thing gets introduced. A handwriting style before a face, a set of initials before a name, a 6-fingered hand before a full body. By the time viewers actually meet him, he has already been built up in the town's own telling as one of the sharpest minds Gravity Falls has ever produced, and the show frames that intelligence the way it frames almost everything else in its world, as a gift with a bill attached that nobody reads the fine print on until it is due. He is a polymath in the old-fashioned sense, a person who cannot leave a mystery alone, who treats an unanswered question the way other people treat an unpaid debt, as something that will not let him rest until it is settled. That is presented early and often as admirable. It is also, without the story ever quite saying so out loud, the thing that nearly destroyed everything he claimed to love. What matters about Ford's curiosity is that it is never treated as neutral. It is framed as a kind of hunger that does not know how to stop eating. Where dippers need to be believed, established earlier in this essay, is a smaller, more human version of the same appetite. Ford is what happens when that appetite is given decades, a genius-level intellect, and absolutely no one around him willing or able to say no. He builds an interdimensional portal in his own house. He fills journal after journal with catalogs of the strange life in the woods around Gravity Falls, correctly identifying it as one of the strangest places on the planet long before anyone else takes the town's weirdness seriously. None of that reads in the moment like villainy. It reads like devotion to the truth, which is exactly the trap being set for both Ford and the audience, because devotion to the truth, taken far enough and insulated from other people's judgment for long enough, starts to look identical to obsession. The portal itself is the hinge the whole tragedy turns on, and the show is careful. In the reveal, it eventually gives across a tale of two Stans to make clear that it did not begin as a weapon or as recklessness. It began as Ford's life's work, the culmination of everything he had studied about the town's anomalies, a genuine attempt to understand something vast rather than to control it for its own sake. What matters more, for the purposes of this chapter, is not the mechanics of how the portal came to exist, which belongs more properly to Stan's half of that reveal already discussed, but the interior cost to Ford of building it the way he did, alone, increasingly isolated, increasingly convinced that his own judgment was the only judgment worth trusting in the room. That isolation is the real setting for his disappearance. The fight with Stan that sends him falling through his own machine is often remembered as a plot event, a twist, the moment the story reveals its central family secret. Read from Ford's side rather than Stan's, it plays differently. It reads like the final, almost inevitable consequence of a man who spent years refusing to let anyone else close enough to stop him before the moment where stopping was still possible. What Gravity Falls does with the 30 years that follow is remarkable mostly for what it refuses to do with them. It would have been easy to write Ford's exile in another dimension as pure suffering, a redemptive sentence served, a man punished into humility by hardship alone. The show does not quite let him off that easily, and it does not quite condemn him that harshly either. Ford survives out there. He adapts. He keeps thinking, keeps cataloging, keeps doing, in exile, the exact same thing that got him exiled in the first place, which is the detail that makes his arc so much sadder than a simple morality tale about hubris punished. He does not come back changed in the sense of having learned to stop pursuing knowledge without limits. He comes back changed in the much smaller, much more human sense of having had 30 years alone to understand exactly what that pursuit cost him, without yet having any way to fix it. Fans who track this side of the story are unusually blunt about the scale of what Ford is carrying by the time the narrative catches up with him properly, and it is worth listing plainly rather than softening, because Gravity Falls itself does not soften it. Ford's actions very nearly end the world. Ford's decades of secrecy and searching put his own grandniece and nephew in direct danger more than once. Ford is the reason his own brother's mind eventually has to be erased to save everyone, a debt that gets paid by someone else's memory rather than his own. And Ford is the reason Fiddleford McGucket, his one-time research partner and closest collaborator, ends up broken, forgetful, living half feral in the woods outside town, a walking casualty of the Portal project that the series plays for laughs, for most of its run before eventually admitting, quietly, exactly whose fault that damage is. That is 4 separate catastrophes attached to one man's need to know everything, and the story lays them out not as a single dramatic villain turn, but as the accumulated residue of a personality that could not recognize the difference between understanding something and having the right to keep pursuing it regardless of who stood near the blast radius. This is where the contrast with Bill Cipher becomes less like 2 characters who happen to be enemies, and more like 2 competing answers to the same underlying question. What does a person do with power once they have it? Ford's answer, for most of his life, is control through understanding. If he can just know enough, catalog enough, map the anomaly precisely enough, he can master it, contain it, turn it into knowledge he owns rather than a mystery that owns him. Bill's answer is the opposite of that from the ground up. Bill does not want to understand chaos. Bill simply is chaos, comfortable in it, entertained by it, allergic to the very idea of a rule that cannot eventually be broken for someone's amusement. When Bill first approaches Ford, offering him a partnership dressed up as intellectual companionship, he is not choosing a random target. He is choosing the one person in Gravity Falls whose entire worldview runs on the premise that anything, given enough study, can be understood and therefore controlled. Because that premise is exactly the kind of confidence a being like Bill knows how to use as a door. Ford's discipline, his belief that rigor and knowledge are a kind of armor against the dangerous and the unknown, is precisely what makes him vulnerable to something that has no interest in being understood at all, only in being let in. That is the argument worth making plainly here, as interpretation rather than as something the show states outright, because Gravity Falls never actually spells out its own thematic architecture in so many words. It shows it. It shows a man who built his entire identity around the idea that knowledge is safety, being undone by an entity whose entire nature disproves that idea. And it shows that same man spending years afterward trying to rebuild some version of control, first through continued research, later through a plan to defeat Bill. That is itself another elaborate act of intellectual mastery, a scheme worked out with the same meticulous precision he once brought to the portal. Ford does not stop being a rationalist just because rationalism nearly ended the world once already. He simply learns slowly to point that same instinct somewhere less catastrophic, which is arguably the most realistic kind of growth Gravity Falls offers any of its adult characters. He does not become a different person, he becomes a more careful version of the same one. The reconciliation between the two brothers, when it finally lands, works as the show's clearest answer to the tension this entire essay keeps circling back to. The pull between control and chaos, order and mess, certainty and trust. It is not narrated here scene by scene, since it belongs to the two of them, and has already been touched on from Stan's side. But what is worth saying plainly, as a reading rather than a plot summary, is that the reconciliation only works because it refuses to resolve into one brother being right and the other being wrong. Stan's philosophy, built on instinct, loyalty, and lies told for love, and Ford's philosophy, built on research, rigor, and knowledge pursued without breaks, do not defeat each other by the end. They correct each other. Stan needed Ford's rigor to finally understand what the portal actually was and what it had actually cost the town. Ford needed Stan's stubborn, uneducated loyalty to survive it all, both literally, since it is Stan who keeps the portal and the house intact for 30 years waiting for a brother he was not even sure was alive, and emotionally, since Stan is the reason Ford has anyone left to come home to. Neither brother's worldview wins outright. Gravity Falls' actual position, if it has one, seems to be that certainty without love is dangerous, and love without honesty is a decades-long lie, and the family only survives by two very different, very flawed men, eventually agreeing to carry a little of each other's philosophy forward instead of only their own. This chapter's plainest opinion is the one that separates Ford from Stan in a way that matters more than the two of them simply having different methods. Stan's sin, examined earlier, was dishonesty, decades of it. And dishonesty is at least a sin most people recognize on sight, one that gets punished by exposure, one whose remedy is simply telling the truth. Ford's sin was never dishonesty. Ford was, if anything, one of the more honest characters in the entire cast. Forthright to the point of social disaster, incapable of small talk, constitutionally unable to pretend he does not know something. His sin was certainty. It was the quiet, corrosive confidence that his own conclusions, reached alone, in isolation, without anyone close enough to check them, were reliable simply because he had reached them carefully. That is a much harder sin to spot, and a much harder one to punish because it does not look like a crime while it is happening. It looks like diligence. It looks like exactly what a smart, careful person is supposed to do. And that, this essay would argue, is what makes Ford the show's most quietly tragic adult. More than Stan, whose tragedy at least has the decency to look like a tragedy from the outside, a man caught in a lie, forced eventually to pay for it. Ford's tragedy looks right up until the portal opens and everything goes wrong, like a success story. It looks like a brilliant man doing exactly what brilliant men are praised for doing, following the truth wherever it leads, refusing to compromise, trusting the evidence over the room. Gravity Falls is unusually brave for a show ostensibly about two kids on summer vacation in suggesting that this particular virtue, taken to its logical end and stripped of anyone willing to argue with it, is not so different from the thing it claims to be the opposite of. Certainty, pursued far enough alone, becomes its own kind of chaos. Ford spends 30 years learning that the hardest way possible, and Gravity Falls' real mercy toward him by the end, is not that it forgives him for nearly ending the world. It is that it lets him come home to a brother who never needed him to be right, only needed him back. There is a version of the Mystery Shack that exists only in the background of other people's stories. The version where a heavyset young man in a fez shuffles through frame carrying a box of tourist junk, delivers one strange, oddly sincere line, and shuffles back out again, and for the first stretch of the series that is roughly all Soos Ramirez is allowed to be. He is furniture. He is atmosphere. He is the handyman who fixes things that were never broken correctly to begin with. And the show treats him at first glance as comic relief in the most literal sense, a source of relief from comedy that is otherwise built on mystery and dread. But Gravity Falls has a habit of hiding its most sincere ideas inside its most disposable-looking characters, and Soos turns out to be one of the clearest cases of that habit anywhere in the series. His philosophy, if you can call something this unassuming a philosophy, is loyalty that asks for nothing back. Not loyalty as a transaction, not loyalty as a strategy for eventually being loved, the way Gideon's devotion to Mabel curdles into something transactional almost immediately, a gift given so that a bigger gift can be demanded in return. Soos's loyalty to Stan, to the shack, to Dipper and Mabel arrives with no invoice attached. He simply keeps showing up. This matters more than it sounds like it should, because everyone else in the Pines family orbit has a wound that explains their attachment to the place. Stan is hiding a portal and a brother and 30 years of lying. Dipper and Mabel are working through the particular ache of a childhood that is visibly running out from under them. Wendy, as we're about to get to, is guarding herself against something specific. Soos, as far as the show ever tells us, does not have an equivalent trauma driving him toward the shack. He just likes it there. He likes Stan genuinely, uncomplicatedly, the way you might like a strange uncle who is rude to you constantly and somehow makes that feel like affection. He calls Stan his hero at multiple points across the series, and Gravity Falls never plays this as pathetic or naive. It plays it as one of the only completely uncomplicated relationships in the entire cast. Soos is not conning anyone and is not being conned. He is not extracting a favor. He has simply decided somewhere off screen, long before the story starts, that this family is his family, and he has never once needed anyone to formally agree with him about it. That inversion is worth pausing on because it flips almost everything else this essay has spent its previous chapters describing. Stan's love is expressed through concealment, through decades of lying that only reveal themselves as love once you know what they were protecting. Ford's love, such as it is, gets tangled permanently with his need to be right, so that even his eventual reconciliation with his brother arrives soaked in guilt. Dipper's love of the truth becomes, at points, indistinguishable from a need to be believed. Every major relationship this show cares about seems to come with some kind of cost attached, some shadow price that has to be paid before the affection counts as real. Soos is the one significant exception. His love just is what it looks like. There is no twist waiting underneath it. No confession scene where we learn the real reason Soos loves the Mystery Shack so much. He loves it because it is where his people are, and that turns out to be enough of a reason, both for him and eventually for Gravity Falls itself. One detail here sounds like trivia and is actually among the stranger pieces of craftsmanship in the entire series. Alex Hirsch, the show's creator, voices Soos himself. He also voices Grunkle Stan, he also voices Old Man McGucket, and he also voices Bill Cipher, the demon at the absolute center of the series' chaos, the entity this essay will spend much of a later chapter treating as something close to Gravity Falls' answer to cosmic nihilism. That is 4 roles for one performer, and 3 of the 4 are, in different registers, father figures. Stan is the surrogate father to Dipper and Mabel, gruff and dishonest and devoted underneath it. McGucket is a broken-down inventor who ends up functioning as a kind of tragicomic elder to the town, and whose backstory, as the previous chapter noted, ties directly back to Ford's culpability rather than existing as pure comic filler. Soos is arguably becoming a father figure himself by the end of the run, a role this chapter is about to get to properly. And then there is Bill, who performs a horrifying, funhouse mirror version of fatherly guidance, offering Gideon and later Ford's own past self a kind of twisted mentorship, promising knowledge and power the way a corrupting father figure might promise inheritance. There is no confirmed statement from Hirsch laying out some grand unified theory about why he chose to voice these four characters specifically, and this essay is not going to invent one because that would be exactly the kind of confident, unverifiable detail this channel tries hard never to manufacture. What can be said honestly is simpler and, in a way, more interesting. One human voice moves fluidly between the show's warmest, most protective figures and its single most destructive one, and there is something unsettling and quietly moving about that once you notice it, because it means those competing philosophies of chaos and care are quite literally coming out of the same mouth. Whether that was a deliberate authorial statement about how thin the line is between the two, or simply the practical result of a small voice cast wearing a lot of hats on a modest animation budget, is not something this essay can claim to know. But the effect on a rewatch, once you know it, is hard to shake. Stan's warmth and Bill's cruelty share a vocal fingerprint. Make of that what you will. My honest opinion is that it makes Soos's uncomplicated goodness land even harder, because it means the same voice that can perform total annihilation can also perform, with total conviction, a man who just wants everyone to have a good day at the gift shop. Soos's arc across the 2 seasons is not loud. He does not get a mystery of the week built entirely around his interior life the way Dipper and Mabel repeatedly do. But watch what actually happens to his position in the story over time, and a clear shape emerges. He starts as an employee. By the end of the series, in the aftermath of Weirdmageddon, with Stan's memory damaged and the family scattering back to their regular lives at summer's end, it is Soos who ends up taking over stewardship of the Mystery Shack itself. This is not a twist Gravity Falls hides or undersells. It is presented plainly, almost gently, as the obvious outcome, the kind of ending that feels inevitable in retrospect precisely because the show has spent 2 seasons quietly building the case for it without ever making a speech about it. And this is where Soos's philosophy stops being just a nice character trait and becomes one of Gravity Falls' genuine arguments. The shack could have gone to a blood relative. Stan's redemption arc could have culminated in him formally passing the business down some more conventional lineage, or finding some way to keep it explicitly inside the Pines bloodline. Instead, the keys go to the employee who showed up every day for reasons nobody ever had to explain. Read that way, Soos's promotion is the clearest single piece of evidence the show offers for one of its central claims. That family, in the way this story actually cares about the word, is built out of consistency and presence rather than out of shared blood. Stan is not Soos's biological family in any sense, but he has been there every summer, fixing what breaks, laughing at Stan's jokes long after anyone else stopped finding them funny, believing in Stan's version of himself even during the stretches when Stan barely believed in it. That is not a small thing, and the story seems to understand as much, which is why it lets that consistency, in the end, outweigh bloodline entirely. My opinion is that this is one of the more radical choices Gravity Falls makes, buried inside what looks like a throwaway feel-good ending, and it rarely gets the credit Stan and Ford's reconciliation gets, probably because it is quieter and does not come with decades of buried lies attached to it. But it might be the single cleanest statement the series ever makes about what family actually means to it. Wendy Corduroy is a different kind of philosophy entirely, and a harder one to read cleanly because her whole presentation is built around not being read. Where Soos wears his loyalty on the outside without any protective coating, Wendy spends most of the series performing a very specific, very recognizable teenage stance. Unbothered, a little bored, faintly amused by everyone else's earnestness, always slightly too cool to be caught caring too much about anything. It is an appealing performance, which is exactly why Dipper falls for it as hard as he does. Cool detachment reads, from the outside, like confidence, like a person who has already figured out the thing everyone else is still anxious about. What the show slowly, carefully complicates is the question of what that detachment is actually protecting. Because detachment, in Wendy's case, is not the same thing as indifference. She works at the shack for money her family clearly needs, and the show lets you notice that without ever making a scene of it. She is dismissive of romantic drama in the abstract while believably invested in her friendships, and at points genuinely uncomfortable with the amount of feeling Dipper directs at her, not because she is cruel, but because she does not entirely know what to do with earnestness that intense, pointed straight at her. Her arcs with Dipper are some of the more emotionally careful writing in the whole series, precisely because Gravity Falls refuses to let either the easy romance version or the easy rejection version happen. Dipper's crush on Wendy, as far as fans have mapped it across the run, spans most of the first season and well into the second, and it is treated neither as something to be cruelly mocked nor as something destined to be triumphantly rewarded. Wendy is kind to him. She is also, repeatedly and gently, clear that she does not see him the way he sees her, and the series lets that be its own kind of respect rather than its own kind of tragedy. What it is actually interested in, underneath the will they won't they surface, is what it costs Wendy to maintain the unbothered persona in front of someone who is so plainly bothered by everything all the time in her direction. There is a genuine tenderness in how Gravity Falls handles this, and it is worth naming directly. Wendy's cool is a strategy, and strategies exist because something needs protecting. The show never fully spells out everything that detachment is guarding, and this essay will not invent details. It cannot verify about her home life or her interior world beyond what the series actually shows. But what the series does show, lightly in the background of scenes that are ostensibly about something else, is a household that runs on toughness as a kind of currency, headed by a father, Manly Dan, whose entire presence on screen is built around an exaggerated, almost comic hypermasculinity, the kind of relentless physical bravado that leaves very little visible room for softness. This essay is deliberately not spending its full attention on that relationship here, because Manly Dan gets fuller treatment later, when this essay reaches the town's chorus of minor characters and can give his particular philosophy the space it deserves without spoiling it here. But it is worth flagging now, briefly, as backdrop because Wendy's guardedness does not come from nowhere. Growing up in a house where toughness is the visible currency of love will teach a person, reliably, that showing you are unbothered is safer than showing you are not. Wendy performs unbothered so fluently that it is easy to forget it is a performance at all. And that is, this essay would argue, exactly the point. The best performed defenses are the ones that stop looking like defenses. What makes Wendy compelling rather than simply cool is that Gravity Falls occasionally lets the performance crack, briefly, without ever turning her into a different character to do it. There are moments across the series where her guard visibly drops around Dipper and around her friends, small moments, unglamorous ones, that matter more for how ordinary they are than for how dramatic they are. The show does not build a mystery box episode around Wendy's inner life the way it does around the journals or the portal or Bill. It does not need to. Her arc works precisely because it is small scale and specific, a single teenager working out how much of herself is safe to show, playing out in the background of a summer that is technically about something much stranger. Put Soos and Wendy next to each other and a shape starts to emerge that this essay thinks gets underrated in most conversations about what Gravity Falls is actually about. On its surface, this is a story about mystics and con men and long-lost twin scientists and an actual dream demon trying to end the world. And it would be easy to assume the moral weight of the series lives entirely with those figures, the ones carrying journals and secrets and cosmic stakes. But Soos and Wendy carry no secret at all in the sense the plot cares about. Soos has no hidden identity, no buried trauma being saved for a reveal episode, no supernatural destiny. Wendy is not secretly anything either, no hidden power, no long game. They are just two ordinary young people working a summer job at a strange gift shop in a strange town. And Gravity Falls almost sneakily makes the argument across its full run that their steadiness, Soos's unearned loyalty, and Wendy's quiet cost of self-protection is the actual emotional floor the rest of the story gets to stand on. Everyone else in this cast is haunted by something, a lie, a rivalry, an unfinished obsession, a cosmic threat. Soos and Wendy are mostly just present, reliably, summer after summer, and my honest reading is that presence, unglamorous and undramatic as it looks next to portals and demons, is exactly what Gravity Falls is quietly arguing counts as heroism most of the time in most people's actual lives. Move now from the two adults who never demanded to be loved back to a run of characters who demand it constantly, sometimes charmingly, sometimes with a small army of animatronics, and Gravity Falls' argument about what happens to people who confuse being obeyed with being adored. Start with Gideon gleeful, because Gideon is where Gravity Falls first shows its hand about what it thinks villainy actually is at a human scale. On the surface, Gideon is a joke, a pint-sized psychic showman in a powder blue suit with a pompadour that seems to defy the season's own weather, running a rival tourist trap and courting Mabel with a sincerity so overcooked it loops back around into menace. It would be easy to write him off as a pure comic antagonist, the pageant kid gone wrong. But watch what Gravity Falls actually gives him to do. Gideon does not want territory. He does not want money in any way that reads as an end in itself. What Gideon wants, relentlessly across his entire run, is Mabel's affection, specifically performed on his terms, and he escalates every single time that affection is not freely given. He blackmails, he manipulates Stan's debts, he eventually seizes the Mystery Shack's deed through legal trickery, all of it in service of forcing a version of love into existence that was never going to arrive honestly. That is the tell. A cosmic villain wants power for its own sake. Gideon wants to be chosen, and when he is not chosen, his solution is never to become someone worth choosing. It is to remove anyone's ability to choose otherwise. This deserves real attention because it is such a precise miniature of the larger argument about control running through the whole series. Gideon is a child whose act mixes real stagecraft with, later, a genuinely magical amulet. Though the story never dwells much on where his gifts end and his gadgets begin, and he has apparently been told his whole short life by doting parents and an adoring public, that charm is the same thing as being loved. Nobody around him seems to have corrected that lesson. So when Mabel, a 12-year-old he has known for a matter of weeks, does not reciprocate a crush built entirely out of performance, Gideon does not experience it as ordinary disappointment. He experiences it as a violation of the natural order he believes he has earned. The series never asks the audience to feel sympathy for what he does with that feeling. The scheming, the blackmail, the eventual alliance with darker forces later in the story, none of that gets softened. But it does ask the audience to notice where the feeling comes from. And that is a more interesting move than simply making him a mustache-twirling child villain. Gideon's tragedy, to the extent Gravity Falls grants him one, is that he has all the tools of charisma and none of the tools of actual connection. And he has never once been told the difference matters. My read is that Gideon is the show's first real test case for the idea that control is what people reach for when they do not know how to ask for love honestly, and he fails that test badly, which is exactly why his redemption, when it eventually comes, has to be so much smaller and quieter than Pacifica's. He gets a chance to be decent. He does not get to be forgiven all the way, and Gravity Falls seems fine with that asymmetry. Which brings us to the family that actually manufactures that same confusion at an industrial scale, generation after generation. Preston and Priscilla Northwest are almost too clean as satire, and that cleanliness is the point. They sit atop Gravity Falls the way old money sits atop most small towns, which is to say not through anything they are currently doing, but through a founding myth they have polished into something between a religion and a marketing campaign. The show gives them an ancestor whose actual historical conduct is considerably less flattering than the family's own retelling of it, and the Northwest's whole self-image depends on nobody looking too closely at the gap between the story and the record. That is really the entire philosophy of inherited status as this town stages it. It is not that the Northwest believe they are good people because of anything they have personally done. It is that they have inherited a story about goodness, dressed up as history, and they treat present-day cruelty toward the town's working class, toward their own daughter, as simply the maintenance cost of keeping that story intact. Preston, in particular, is written as a man for whom appearances are not a mask over some private decency. They are the entire operating system. Priscilla is quieter but no less complicit, enforcing the same standards through a kind of icy, smiling absence rather than Preston's blustering control. Together they are less a couple than a machine for producing a certain kind of child, and Gravity Falls is very interested in what happens when that machine's product starts to malfunction. That product is Pacifica, and her arc is, in my view, the clearest and most satisfying redemption story the series tells among its purely human cast. More legible even than Stan's because Pacifica's redemption has almost nothing to do with secrets and everything to do with simple exposure to consequence. She starts as exactly what her parents built her to be, a small, precise instrument of social cruelty, deployed against Mabel and anyone else who threatens the Northwest family's sense of hierarchy. And crucially, the writers do not soften that first version of her to make the later turn easier. Early Pacifica is genuinely unkind, not misunderstood, not secretly nice underneath, actually cruel in the specific bored, entitled way that money without accountability tends to produce in children who have never once had to face a cost for it. The turn comes not from a single grand revelation, but from repeated smaller moments where Pacifica is forced to see the mechanics of her own family up close. The actual coldness underneath the manners, the way her parents' love for her is conditional on her performance of their values in exactly the way Gideon's audience loved him for his performance of charm. Once she sees that clearly, she cannot fully unsee it, and Gravity Falls lets her keep some of her old sharpness. Her humor stays cutting, her instincts stay a little defensive, but the cruelty stops being load-bearing. She starts choosing Dipper and Mabel's company, not out of some sudden conversion to niceness, but because their friendship does not require her to keep performing a version of herself she has started to find exhausting. The reason this reads as the clearest redemption philosophy in the whole cast is that it is built entirely on something ordinary and available to anyone watching. The idea that values you did not choose can still be unlearned once you actually see what they cost, both to other people and eventually to yourself. Pacifica was never possessed by anything, never manipulated by a demon, never forced into her cruelty by circumstances beyond her control the way, say, McGucket's story will turn out to have been. She was simply raised inside a value system and given, across the years the story covers, enough small, honest encounters with people outside that system to notice the seams in it. That is a genuinely modest, human-sized kind of change, and Gravity Falls treats it with more patience and more specificity than it gives almost any other character's growth. It is also, worth saying plainly, the version of change that requires no forgiveness ritual and no grand gesture, just sustained proximity to people who refuse to play along with the old rules. I find that quietly more moving than most of the show's bigger emotional beats, precisely because it asks so little of the mythology and so much of the character herself. Set next to Pacifica, Robbie Valentino is a much smaller case, almost a footnote by comparison. But he is a useful one because he shows the same interest in performed identity working at an even lower stakes, more mundane register. Robbie is the brooding teenage boyfriend, motorcycle jacket, skull motifs, a band nobody particularly likes. And Dipper spends a fair amount of early screen time treating him as a genuine romantic threat, a fully formed rival with real menace. The actual joke, delivered gradually rather than all at once, is that there is considerably less to Robbie than the aesthetic promises. Strip away the jacket and the eyeliner and the moody song lyrics, and what is left is a fairly ordinary, somewhat insecure teenager who has built an entire persona out of the visual grammar of brooding without much underneath it. That is actually dark or dangerous. He is not evil. He is barely even a real obstacle in the end, so much as a costume Dipper mistook for a character. There is something almost gentle in how Gravity Falls handles this. It never humiliates Robbie outright. It just lets the gap between his performance and his substance become visible over time. The same gap that defines Gideon and the Northwests at a much higher volume. Robbie's version of it costs nobody anything except a bit of Dipper's misplaced anxiety, which is exactly why he works as this chapter's lightest example rather than its centerpiece. He is what starved neediness or inherited status looks like when it never gets the chance, or the ambition, to curdle into something that actually hurts people. Same shape, much smaller consequences. The consequences get much larger and much sadder in Old Man McGucket, and this is the point in the chapter where the tone has to shift. Because McGucket is not really a comic figure once you know what Gravity Falls eventually tells you about him, even though for most of his screen time he is played almost entirely for laughs. The wild-haired old man rambling about raccoons in his shorts and inventing improbable machines out of junk. That comic surface is doing real narrative work because it lets the show introduce him early as background color, a piece of small-town texture, before revealing much later that his condition has an origin, and that the origin is not random. McGucket was, according to the fuller account laid out across the series and its companion material, a brilliant engineer who worked closely with Stanford Pines on the Portal project, and whose mind was damaged, his memory deliberately wiped as part of the fallout from that work. His current state, the incoherence, the isolation, the years spent essentially discarded on the margins of the town he once helped shape, is not a quirky character trait the writers invented for texture. It is a cost. It is one of the concrete items on the list of harm that Ford himself is shown to carry guilt over. alongside nearly ending the world and endangering Dipper and Mabel and erasing his own brother's memory. McGucket's ruined life sits on that list, plainly as something Ford did to another person in the pursuit of pure knowledge. And once you know that, you cannot watch McGucket's earlier scenes quite the same way again. That recontextualization is, in this essay's view, one of the more quietly devastating moves Gravity Falls makes across its whole run, precisely because it never slows down to underline it. The show lets you laugh at McGucket for a long stretch of episodes before it tells you, almost in passing, that the laughter had a body count of 1, a man's mind, and years of his life, and that the person responsible for it is one of the most sympathetic adult figures in the whole cast. It does not ask you to stop finding McGucket funny exactly. His energy and his eventual partial recovery keep some of that comic register intact even afterward. But it does ask you to hold both things at once, the comedy and the cost, in a way that feels much closer to how damage actually sits inside real communities, half visible, mostly unspoken, absorbed by everyone around it as simply the way things are. McGucket becomes, by this later accounting, the series' saddest philosophical figure. Not because his suffering is the most dramatic on screen, Bill's apocalypse is louder, Ford's guilt is more articulate, but because his suffering stays the most invisible for the longest stretch of runtime, dressed the whole time in a costume of comic relief that only comes off once the writers decide you are ready to actually look at what is underneath it. Put these four together: Gideon's starved need to be adored, the Northwest's inherited mythology weaponized into present-day cruelty, Pacifica's proof that inherited values can be unlearned, McGucket's proof of what unexamined ambition costs the people standing closest to it, and one thesis holds the whole chapter together. None of these are cosmic villains, none of them are chaos given form, the way Bill eventually will be. They are, every one of them, people who reached for control, over affection, over a town's history, over a daughter's behavior, over the boundaries of scientific knowledge, instead of reaching for something harder and more honest. And the show's real argument is that this specific failure, choosing control over honesty, is always survivable, always reversible, in a way that a demon's hunger for chaos simply is not. Gideon gets a chance, small as it is, because his crime was needing love badly enough to fake it rather than earn it, and that is a fixable kind of broken. Pacifica gets a full and generous redemption because her crime was inherited rather than chosen, and inheritance can be renounced. Even McGucket, victim rather than villain in this particular accounting, gets partial restoration because what was done to him was damage, not evil, and damage can sometimes be undone. Bill Cipher, when this essay gets to him properly, will not get any of that. And the difference between his story and every story in this chapter is exactly the difference between a person who chose control and a force that simply is control, wearing a triangle for a body and treating the entire world as something to be arranged rather than understood. Not every character in Gravity Falls gets a philosophy in the sense the last few chapters have been describing. An interior logic that Gravity Falls slowly excavates and asks you to weigh. Most of the town does not get that treatment, and it should not, because a 12-year-old summer needs a chorus as much as it needs protagonists, background people whose entire function is to make Gravity Falls feel like a place with a population rather than a stage set with 4 load-bearing families on it. But even a chorus carries a worldview, usually a much smaller and much funnier one, and if you actually listen to what these background characters are for, rather than just enjoying the noise they make, a second layer of the show's argument becomes visible. One built out of jokes rather than grief. Where Stan and Ford argue about honesty and knowledge, and Gideon and the Northwests argue about control, the town's chorus argues, almost entirely through comic timing, about something smaller and just as real. How much effort a person is willing to put into understanding the world around them before deciding they'd rather not. Start with Sheriff Blubbs and Deputy Derlin because they are the purest distillation of that idea the series has to offer. They are, on paper, the entire law enforcement apparatus of Gravity Falls, a town that over its run plays host to gnome uprisings, a shape-shifting monster, a psychic child villain with his own television special, an interdimensional portal, and eventually a demon triangle staging an actual apocalypse in the town square. And through all of it, Blubbs and Derlin remain committed, sincere, almost aggressively unbothered. They show up to crime scenes and misread them. They investigate strange occurrences and arrive at wrong, cheerful conclusions. They are never cruel and never actually stupid in the sense of malice. They are just profoundly, structurally incurious. Two men who have decided that the job of maintaining order in a town this weird is best done by simply not looking directly at the weirdness. It is a kind of institutional version of the coping mechanism this essay already spent time on with Mabel, choosing a comfortable frame over an accurate one. Where Mabel's optimism costs her something and eventually forces a reckoning, Blub's and Durlin's incompetence never seems to cost the town anything at all, because the show has structured itself so that the actual danger always gets handled by two kids and their great uncles instead. That is a joke about civic authority as much as it is a joke about them personally, a background argument that Gravity Falls survives. Not because its systems work, but because its people occasionally do, in spite of the systems. There is a small, gentler beat that follows Blubs and Durland into the finale, where the closing montage includes an image many viewers have read as confirming that the two of them are, in fact, a couple, holding hands in a way the show never makes a plot point out of, and never comments on directly. It is worth mentioning here specifically because it recontextualizes everything that came before it, without asking for credit for doing so. Two men who spent the entire series performing genial obliviousness are given, in Gravity Falls' very last stretch, a moment of plain, unremarked-upon tenderness, and it simply lets the image sit there rather than turning it into a punchline or a revelation. Whether you clock it as one of the softer touches in the whole series or miss it entirely depends on how closely you are watching two characters. The writers never asked you to watch closely at all, which is itself the point. The rest of the town's supporting cast is best understood not as individuals with arcs, but as a set of specific, compact philosophies, deployed briefly and then set back down. Lazy Susan, running the local diner with one working eye and a permanent, undisturbed cheer, stands for contentment as a survival strategy in a town this strange. She has apparently decided that noticing less is simply more pleasant than noticing more. Toby Determined, the reporter for the town's newspaper, is the opposite instinct wearing the same shrug, a man whose entire personality is ambition without any of the competence that would normally accompany it, chasing stories with total conviction and getting almost everything about them wrong. Manly Dan, Wendy's father, is bluntness as a whole personality, physical strength substituting for emotional vocabulary. He solves problems by hitting them, and he loves his daughter in a register the series plays for laughs precisely because underneath the joke there is something genuine there too. A father who never quite learned softer language and uses the only one he has. Candy Chew and Grenda, Mabel's two closest friends, function as a matched pair. Candy's quiet intensity against Grenda's loud, blunt physicality, both of them totally loyal to Mabel in ways that never require explanation. Unlike almost every other relationship this essay has examined, their friendship with her is never tested, never costed, never put through a betrayal and a repair. It just is, uncomplicated, which is its own kind of philosophical statement, in a story this obsessed with the price of trust. And Waddles, Mabel's pig, won at a fair and adopted on the spot, might be the simplest and most complete statement of unconditional loyalty in the entire cast. A character with no interiority anyone ever pretends to examine, who exists purely to demonstrate that love, at its most basic, does not require understanding anything about the person or the pig you're loving. None of these characters need a deep reading. That restraint is the reading. Gravity Falls knows exactly how much weight each one is built to carry, and it never asks any of them to carry more. Then there are the gnomes and their self-appointed leader, Jeff, who function less as background texture and more as an actual parable, dressed up as a monster of the week plot. In an early episode, the gnomes decide that Mabel should become their queen, and rather than simply asking her or courting her or doing anything resembling consent, they attempt to physically combine themselves into one enormous composite gnome shaped roughly like a man, so that this single assembled being can marry her whole. It is a genuinely strange image even by this town's standards. Dozens of small individual creatures giving up their separate shapes to become one artificial whole for the sake of possessing someone. It is not hard to see what the writers are doing with it. The gnomes are conformity taken to its most literal, most physically grotesque extreme. Individuality dissolved entirely into a mass in service of a claim on somebody else's affection. And Mabel's rejection of them is not just a rejection of a bad suitor. It is the clearest statement in the whole cast that love built on erasing yourself into a larger, more convenient shape is not actually love at all, whatever it calls itself. Jeff, as their spokesman, gets to be smug and persuasive right up until the moment the whole scheme collapses, because a story this attentive to what real affection costs was never going to let a swarm of identical little men absorb their way into it. Multi-Bear deserves more care than his premise usually gets, because on the surface he is a punchline, a bear built out of the heads of several other bears, encountered deep in the woods as one more monster of the week obstacle for Dipper and his friends. But this character does something rarely bothered with for anything this disposable, which is get an actual moment of sincerity underneath the joke. Multi-Bear talks about being different from the other bears around him, about not quite fitting the shape everyone expects a bear in these woods to take, and it is allowed to sit there plainly without irony in a scene that could very easily have just been a punchline about a weird-looking creature, and instead becomes briefly an actual statement about identity and belonging, delivered completely straight in the middle of a silly premise. It would have been easy to play Multi-Bear purely for the visual gag and move on. Instead, he gets a real emotional register for maybe a minute of screen time, treated with a level of respect his design does not obviously earn, and then the scene moves on without dwelling on it further. This is, honestly, one of the more overlooked moments in the entire series, precisely because it arrives inside a joke and most viewers are laughing too hard at the concept to notice something sincere has been slipped in underneath it. It is the one scene in this whole supporting cast that catches me every time I rewatch it. A creature built out of difference, made from several things stitched into one, talking plainly about what it is like to not look like everyone around you, tucked into an episode that exists mostly so the kids have somewhere weird to go that week. It is a small scene. It does not ask to be a big one, but it earns its place in any honest accounting of what this world actually believes about identity, arguably more than several of its bigger, louder set pieces manage to. Blendin' Blandine and Time Baby exist to make an entirely different kind of joke, one about fate and authority rather than identity. Blendin is a low-level employee of a bureaucratic organization tasked with monitoring and correcting anomalies in time travel. And Time Baby, glimpsed only occasionally, is presented as the literal infant ruler who sits atop that entire structure. It is an image the writers clearly find funny precisely because it is so deliberately undignified. Ultimate cosmic authority over the flow of time itself, administered by paperwork, committee, and an actual baby in charge. Where a lesser series might have made time travel mystical, prophecy and destiny and grand cosmic design, this one makes it administrative, full of forms and jurisdictions, and a put-upon functionary just trying to keep his temporal paperwork straight while two kids keep breaking his schedule with a stolen time device disguised, memorably, as something involving a pig. The joke works because it deflates the genre it is borrowing from. Time travel stories usually treat fate as something vast and inevitable, and this one treats it as something you could probably get out of if you filed the right appeal, which is a genuinely funny thing for a kids' show to suggest about the nature of destiny, that maybe the biggest forces governing your life are not fixed laws of the universe so much as tired civil servants doing their best with an unreasonable workload. And then, right alongside all of that, sit two much smaller running gags that still manage to carry a worldview if you squint at them. Zyler and Kraz, the beach guys who turn up in a time loop caused by exactly the kind of temporal chaos Blendin is supposed to be preventing, spend the joke blissfully unaware that they are repeating the same carefree hangout over and over, endlessly cheerful, endlessly shallow. Hedonism with absolutely no consequence attached because the loop resets before consequence can ever arrive. It is a small, throwaway gag about people who have accidentally found a way to live entirely in the present tense, and nobody moralizes about it. The joke is just allowed to be the joke, two guys perpetually having the best day of their lives without ever noticing it is the same day. Rumble McSkirmish, the fighting game character who gets pulled out of his video game and into the actual physical world, works a similar seam from the other direction. Fiction taking on enough weight and consistency to start bumping into reality. A joke about how thin the line really is between the stories we invent for entertainment and the world we're supposedly telling them in. Neither of these characters is doing anything as sustained as what Multi-Bear or the gnomes are doing. They are gags, plainly, meant to land and pass. But even a gag like this one carries a shape of its own: hedonism without a bill coming due, fiction without a wall keeping it out, and the fact that a story this dense with grief and family and cosmic dread still finds room to let two surfer dudes and a video game character make small, specific arguments about how a person or a story might choose to exist says something about how thoroughly this world has been built. Nothing in Gravity Falls is purely decorative for very long. Even the parts designed to be forgotten by the next scene are quietly making a case for something. And that, more than any single character examined properly in this chapter, is the actual thesis worth landing on here. A town this strange does not just need heroes and villains to make sense. It needs a chorus, and this show trusted its chorus enough to let even the smallest of them mean something. Bill Cipher does not arrive in Gravity Falls the way its other threats do. Gideon has a face, a childhood, a documented grudge. Robbie has a car and a bad haircut and a broken heart. Even the gnomes have bodies you can see and count. Bill arrives first as a triangle drawn on the inside of a journal page, a symbol tucked into the corners of episodes before anyone in the story has met him. Which means the audience is technically introduced to Bill Cipher long before the characters are, a detail the show uses with a kind of quiet confidence that it will pay off later. And it does pay off in the Season 1 episode Dreamscapers, the 19th of that season, which aired in the winter of the show's first season, when Stan enters Dipper's mind to retrieve the missing pages of Journal 3 and finds Bill already waiting there, cheerful, yellow, and completely willing to talk. That episode is the moment Bill stops being a background cipher for fans to decode and becomes an actual character with actual leverage over the plot, a dream demon who can walk into somebody's head the way another person might walk into a kitchen. What makes that scene land the way it does, and what a lot of casual viewing skates past, is that Bill Cipher is voiced by Alex Hirsch, the same performer who does Stanford Pines, the weary con man learning to love his family late in life, and the same performer who does Soos, unearned loyalty given a body and a voice. He also voices Old Man McGucket, the broken genius whose ruin this essay has already traced back to Ford's choices. One actor, 4 roles, and 3 of those 4 roles are, in one way or another, father figures. The 4th is the thing that very nearly ends the world. This is a documented production fact, not a reading, and it deserves to be kept that way, because it would be easy to turn it into a tidy metaphor that Gravity Falls never actually claims for itself. Nothing on record suggests Hirsch cast himself as Bill to make some grand statement about chaos hiding inside every fatherly voice. But once you know it, you cannot stop hearing it, and that lingers oddly long after the credits roll. The same warm, slightly gravelly register that tells Dipper it will be okay is, in another scene entirely, the register offering to trade a kid's free will for a magic pen. It is an accident of casting economics as much as anything, a small show that needed its creator to fill in wherever the budget and schedule required it. And yet the effect on the finished product is genuinely strange to think about, that the voice of comfort and the voice of the apocalypse share the same set of vocal cords. Bill's own account of where he comes from is not something the original 40 episodes spend much time on. What the series gives you directly is a demon who claims dominion over dreams, who trades in favors and deals the way Stan trades in merchandise markups, who seems to already know everyone's secrets before they tell him. Where he was before all that is left as an open question inside the show itself, one of the genuine unanswered mysteries this essay's earlier chapter on longevity gestured toward without resolving. The fuller account involving Bill originating in a separate, 2-dimensional universe, a flat plane of existence populated by beings like himself, which he reportedly came to despise and is reported to have destroyed, comes from tie-in material published well after Gravity Falls concluded, and that plainly deserves flagging rather than letting it slide by disguised as something the television series itself confirmed. It is a good story. It gives Bill's contempt for 3-dimensional life a kind of backstory logic, a being who annihilated his own flat, limited home, and then set his sights on a fuller, richer reality he could not originally perceive. But it is expanded lore, arriving years after Weirdmageddon aired, and the honest thing to do here is hold it at that distance. If you want the version the original series actually puts on screen, Bill is presented mostly as an appetite with a top hat, a force whose past barely matters next to what he wants right now, which is Ford's mind, and then the whole town, and then, eventually, everything. There is a similarly shaped situation with what fans and later sourcing call the Nightmare Realm, sometimes given other names across the expanded material, described as a lawless, physics-free expanse between dimensions, a kind of interdimensional foam where Bill is said to have ruled after leaving his original flat universe behind. According to that same body of tie in material, this realm was never stable to begin with. An inherently temporary space fated to collapse under its own contradictions, and Bill's ambition to escape into another dimension, our dimension, reads less like malice chosen for its own sake, and more like a survival strategy from a creature who knew his own home was going to come apart underneath him. This is, again, framed here as reported lore rather than something the 40 broadcast episodes spell out in detail, but it does something useful for how you understand the character even if you only ever watch the series itself and never touch a companion book. It reframes Bill's hunger not as evil for the sake of evil, a mustache-twirling villain who wants chaos because chaos is fun, though he clearly also finds it fun, but as something closer to a cornered animal with godlike powers, trying to get out of a house that is burning down before it burns down around him. That does not make him sympathetic exactly, it makes him coherent in a way that a purely random force of destruction would not be, and coherence is, I think, the more interesting choice than nihilism for its own sake, because it means even Gravity Falls' most chaotic figure is still operating according to something like self-interest, the same currency every other character in this essay has been shown trading in, just wearing it at a cosmic scale instead of a human one. Weirdmageddon, the finale arc that closes out the series, is where all of that theory stops being background and becomes the actual weather. And I want to talk about it here the way this essay has talked about this series' other major arcs, which is thematically tracing what it does to the philosophies already built up rather than walking back through the plot beat by beat, because most of the audience for a video like this one has already had that arc narrated to them in detail elsewhere, including on this channel. What Weirdmageddon actually is, underneath the triangles in the sky and the town turned into a fairground of nightmares, is a pressure test applied to every single belief system this essay has spent its runtime cataloging. Dipper's need for evidence and being right gets tested against a situation where the rules themselves have stopped holding, where a journal cannot save you because the thing threatening you wrote half its own rulebook as it went. Mabel's chosen joy gets tested against genuine despair, a stretch of the story where her optimism is not just inconvenienced but actively targeted, weaponized against her, turned into a trap built specifically to exploit how much she wants comfort and belonging. Stan's whole philosophy of love, expressed through concealment, gets tested by a crisis that finally forces every secret into the open at once. No more lies left to tell, only the truth and what he is willing to give up to protect the people he spent decades lying to. Ford's control through understanding gets tested by an opponent who understands the rules of reality itself better than he does, which is the one thing Ford, a man used to being the sharpest mind in whatever room he enters, has never had to face before. Soos and Wendy get tested for whether their steadiness holds under actual apocalyptic pressure rather than just ordinary small-town weirdness. And the series' answer, without re-narrating every scene of it, is that it does hold, that the found family logic explored earlier in this essay was not a fair weather arrangement. Even Pacifica gets tested, her unlearned inheritance from the Northwest family given an actual crucible to prove itself in, rather than just a private, comfortable change of heart back home. Weirdmageddon does not introduce new values into these characters. It simply removes every soft landing and asks whether the values that were already there can survive without one. That, more than the spectacle of it, is the argument I think the arc is actually making, and it is the reason the finale earns the weight it has, because nothing in it is a surprise about who anyone is. It is only a surprise about how much that identity is going to cost them to keep. The way Bill's threat actually ends is a detail worth being precise about, because it gets flattened in casual retellings into something simpler and more conventional than what actually happens on screen. People will tell you Stan shot Bill, or that Ford finally beat him in some Grand Wizard's duel, and neither of those is quite right. What happens, and this is documented plainly across the series' own broadcast material, is that Ford anticipates Bill will try to double-cross the group at the moment of victory, and prepares for it using the memory gun, a device that had originally belonged to the Society of the Blind Eye and existed in its ordinary use to erase specific memories from a person's mind. the same mechanism the town's authorities had once used to make Gravity Falls forget its own supernatural history rather than confront it. That is the device's normal job, a small, targeted eraser. What Ford does with it in the finale is turn that small, targeted tool into something total. With Bill occupying Stan's mind, Ford sets the gun to erase everything, not a memory, not a decade, the whole of Stanley Pine's recorded self, on the logic that if there is no mind left for Bill to occupy, there is nothing left for Bill to be. And that is exactly what happens. Bill Cipher is not defeated in the sense of losing a fight, though there is a physical confrontation before this point that does knock him down to a shrunken, weakened state. He is erased from existence inside a mind that no longer exists to hold him, a strange and quietly devastating way for a show ostensibly aimed at children to resolve its villain, because the cost of it does not fall on Bill in any way you can picture. It falls on Stan. Nobody in this story lets that cost go unspoken. Stan wakes up afterward not knowing his own family, not recognizing Ford, not recognizing Dipper and Mabel, an emptiness that the earlier chapters of this essay, when discussing Stan's decades of lying to protect his brother and his niece and nephew, already flagged as the eventual price of that kind of love. Here is where the bill actually comes due. He gave his memory the entire architecture of who he understood himself to be, to erase the worst thing that had ever threatened his family, and the finale frames that trade with real weight rather than treating it as a clever plot mechanic to be solved and moved past. What partially heals it, and I want to be careful with the word partially here because that is exactly what the source material supports, and no more, is Mabel's scrapbook, the physical collection of photographs and small mementos from their summer together that she assembles and uses to help rebuild some fragment of Stan's mindscape after the erasure. It works to a degree. Some of him comes back, but nothing on screen claims it works completely, and treating it as a full, clean restoration would be dishonest to what actually airs. Stan gets pieces of himself back through the people who loved him enough to hand him evidence of who he used to be, which is, if you want the tidy version of the thesis, a kind of mirror image of Dipper's whole philosophy from the start of this essay. Evidence is the thing that proves what is real, except here the evidence being gathered is not proof of monsters, it is proof of a person, assembled by the people who refused to let him disappear entirely. That is not a happy ending exactly, it is a survivable one, which in this world tends to be the most anyone gets. And then there is the very last thing Bill says as he comes apart, a final word the finale gives him rather than denying him outright. As Bill dissolves, he invokes something called the axolotl, a name dropped once, at the worst possible moment for him, like a man calling out to a landlord he owes money to. I will not reproduce that line directly here, since it is the show's exact dialogue and this essay has held to paraphrase rather than quotation throughout. But the beat itself is well documented and worth sitting with because the original series never explains it at all. It just leaves that name sitting there, unglossed, a loose thread deliberately left loose. What the fuller account, again arriving through later companion material rather than the original broadcast episodes, suggests is that the axolotl is something like a steward of reality itself, a being positioned above Bill in whatever cosmic order this universe actually runs on. Which would mean that across years of fan speculation and 2 seasons of actual television, audiences had been watching what felt like the ultimate threat, the biggest, strangest, most powerful thing this small Oregon town could possibly produce, only to have that same threat, in his very last conscious moment, look upward and invoke something bigger than himself. I find that detail more unsettling than almost anything else in the finale, more than the invasion, more than the memory loss, because it means Bill Cipher, who spent the whole series positioning himself as the top of the food chain, the one telling everyone else the rules, was never actually at the top of anything. He was just the worst thing the Pines family personally had to survive. Somewhere above him, unexplained and largely unshown, sits whatever the axolotl actually is, and the writers, to their credit, do not pretend to have an answer ready. They just let that word hang in the air as the credits roll toward it, an admission, deliberate or not, that even the story's biggest villain was only ever a chapter in something larger. The series was never going to fully open in the time it had left. Whatever the axolotl is, Gravity Falls handed the question to its audience rather than answering it. And for a little while, that was where things stood. The series ended in February of 2016 with the loose thread still loose, Bill erased, Stan's mind rebuilding itself around a scrapbook of photographs, the town saved and a little poorer for it, and the credits rolling on 40 episodes that had, by design, stopped answering their own mysteries at the exact moment those mysteries stopped mattering more than the people carrying them. But the story did not end there the way most television endings end there, quietly, completely, with nothing left to say. It kept getting supplemented, expanded, annotated in a string of books released over the following years. And if this whole essay has been about tracking what each character believes, then those books are worth a closing look. They do something unusual. They let a few of these characters, Ford chief among them, and much later Bill himself, explain their own philosophy in their own words, on the page, outside the fiction of the 22-minute episode. That is a different kind of evidence than anything the broadcast series gave us, and it deserves a different kind of care. The first of these arrived quickly. Gravity Falls. Journal 3 was published on the 26th of July, 2016, only a few months after the finale aired, written by Alex Hirsch and Rob Renzetti, with art from Andy Gonçalves and Stephanie Ramirez. It became a #1 New York Times bestseller and by some accounts stayed on that list for around 47 weeks, a startling run for a tie-in book to a children's cartoon that had just wrapped up on a network known more for turnover than longevity. What Journal 3 actually does, in form, is present itself as the physical object at the center of the whole story, the real journal, filled out completely with Ford's own handwriting, his own asides, his own corrections, and second thoughts scrawled in the margins, the way an actual field researcher's notebook would look after decades of use. It gives readers the author's full account in his own voice for the first time, which matters for the argument this essay has been making about Ford specifically. Across the television series, Ford is a mystery wrapped inside another mystery. First, the missing author nobody has met, then the returned brother nobody quite trusts, then the polymath whose personality only comes into focus gradually, scene by scene, mostly through how Stan and the twins react to him. Journal 3 flips that. It puts his interior monologue directly in front of you. You get his handwriting, his footnotes, his private doubts about his own research, written in first person rather than filtered through someone else's dialogue about him. It is, in a very literal sense, the closest the franchise ever gets to letting Ford narrate his own philosophy, rather than have it inferred from his behavior. And it is also, notably, the book that gives fans a fuller account of the axolotl concept than the handful of frame-by-frame viewers who had already been arguing about that dying invocation online ever had. Gravity Falls planted the word on screen. The book is where that fuller account of what the word actually refers to gets written down. The axolotl remains, even in the expanded material, a strange and only partially explained figure, a being positioned above Bill in whatever cosmic order the setting runs on, closer to a steward or an overseer of reality than a character with a conventional arc. Journal 3 deepens the lore around this idea without fully resolving it into something as simple and legible as a normal villain or a normal god. That restraint, whether it was a deliberate choice or simply the natural limit of how much a companion book can carry, strikes me as consistent with everything else this franchise does with its own mythology. It tells you enough to feel the shape of something much larger sitting just outside the frame, and then it stops, leaving you to wonder, which is exactly the same trick the original series pulled with Bill's origin, with Stan's 30 years of silence, with the entire structure of a show that made its money on the space between what characters know and what they say. There is also a second book worth naming honestly, and that word matters here, because this is the part of the research where the verified facts thin out the most. Gravity Falls. Lost Legends is a real published anthology of further stories set in and around the world of the show, expanding side material for characters who did not get full arcs in the original 40 episodes. I'm not going to attach a firm year to it here because the sourcing available for this essay disagreed with itself on exactly when it came out, and this is a channel that would rather leave a date soft than hand you a wrong one dressed up as fact. What matters more than the publication year for a philosophy-driven essay like this one is what kind of book it is. It reads as an expansion of texture rather than an expansion of meaning. It gives more time to characters the television series only sketched, more vignettes, more small adventures, but it does not, as far as the verified material available here indicates, fundamentally alter the underlying arguments this essay has been making about any of its major figures. Stan is still the con man who cons himself last. Ford is still the rationalist paying for his own certainty. Bill is still the entity whose worldview, at that point in the franchise's timeline, has to be reconstructed from what he does rather than what he says about himself. Lost Legends adds pages, it does not add a new thesis, and that distinction is worth holding on to because not every piece of expanded material is created equal. And part of taking a franchise seriously is knowing which editions actually move the philosophical needle and which ones are simply more of a good thing. Which brings us to the book that does move the needle, and honestly, this is the one that reframes how this entire essay should be read in hindsight. The Book of Bill was released on the 23rd of July, 2024, published by Hyperion Avenue Books, and written by Alex Hirsch, and it is told entirely from Bill Cipher's own point of view. It covers his origin story, his numerous attempts to conquer Earth, his relationship with the Pines family, and according to the material describing it, his characteristically terrible advice on topics ranging from love to humanity in general. This feels like the single strangest thing to happen to this franchise since the finale aired, and I say that as someone who has spent this whole essay building an understanding of Bill secondhand. For 8 years, everything anyone said about Bill Cipher's philosophy, everything I have said across this essay's own chapter on him, had to be built the way you build an understanding of any fictional entity that only ever acts and never explains. By inference, by pattern, by watching what he does under pressure and reasoning backward toward what he must believe. He wants freedom from a collapsing dimension. He treats truth as a tool rather than a value. He performs friendliness as a weapon. All of that is a defensible reading of the original 40 episodes, but it is still reading, still interpretation built on the outside of a locked door. And then, 8 years after the door had apparently been shut for good, closed by the finale, closed further by the memory gun, closed again by 2 companion books that mostly filled in gaps around other characters, Alex Hirsch simply opened it and let Bill Cipher explain himself in his own words, at book length, in first person, unfiltered by anyone else's narration. There is something almost unsettling about that, and I do not think it is an accident. Bill's entire menace across the original series depended on him being unknowable in exactly this way. He was a triangle. He did not have a face you could read for tells the way you can read a human face. His logic operated according to rules he made up as he went, rules about deals and eye contact and dreams that he explained just enough to make them feel consistent without ever letting you get far enough underneath them to predict him reliably. Part of what made Dreamscapers land as a real threat, back when this essay covered his introduction, was precisely that gap between how much Bill clearly knew about everyone else's inner life and how little the audience was allowed to know about his. A show can only sustain an entity like that by keeping him at arm's length. The moment you give him a memoir, you have decided that arm's length is no longer the point, that there is more value now in letting people finally hear the argument from the argument's own mouth, even at the cost of some of that original mystery. Here's my honest reaction to that trade, because this channel exists to give you an actual opinion rather than just a summary, and that opinion is mixed. Part of me thinks a manifesto from Bill Cipher is the most satisfying possible answer to 8 years of fan argument, a genuine gift to the people who spent that whole time building theories out of the smallest gestures in his handful of episodes. Another part of me thinks that the show's original power came partly from never letting him have the last word, from ending on Ford's caution and Stan's memory loss, and a scrapbook of ordinary summer photographs rather than on Bill's own explanation of himself, and that there is a real cost to reversing that 8 years later, even a cost worth paying. Both of those things can be true at once. A text can be a genuine gift to a fandom and still slightly dilute the particular kind of dread that made the original character work in the first place. There is no clean answer here, and I am not going to pretend there is one just to give this essay a tidier ending than it has earned. What I can tell you, carefully, is that reporting around the book's release has indicated it resolves a long-standing question fans had been carrying about Bill's ultimate fate, something beyond what the original finale left settled. I will not guess at the specific content of that answer here. I have not verified it closely enough to state it as fact, And this is exactly the kind of detail this channel treats as sacred. Better to tell you honestly that something exists and I have not confirmed its specifics than to hand you an invented resolution dressed up as something I read on the page. If you want that particular answer, it is out there in the book itself, and I would rather point you toward the source than fabricate a shortcut to it. What matters for this essay's purposes is simpler, and I think more durable than any single plot detail anyway, that a franchise built entirely on withheld information chose, 8 years after its television ending, to finally let its central chaos figure speak plainly about himself, and that the choice to do that at all tells you something about how this creator thinks about closure. Some shows leave their villains as permanent question marks because the writers ran out of ideas. Gravity Falls left Bill Cipher as a question mark on purpose, and then, on its own timeline, years later, decided the question had been open long enough. That instinct, choosing exactly when to stop keeping a secret rather than being forced into it, actually threads all the way back through Gravity Falls' entire production history, and it is worth closing on because I think it explains more about this franchise's philosophy than any single character's arc does. In November of 2015, as most retrospectives on the show recount, Alex Hirsch announced publicly that the series would conclude with its second season. He was direct about the reasoning. He stated that ending the series at 2 seasons was, in his words, 100% his choice, and he specifically said it was not being canceled. That single decision runs against the instinct most long-running franchises have, the impulse to keep going as long as there is an audience willing to watch, to stretch a mystery until it becomes shapeless, to let the questions outlive the reasons anyone first asked them. Hirsch did the opposite. He had built an entire show around the tension between what characters know and what they are willing to say, around journals hidden in the woods, around a con man who lied to an entire town for 30 years, around a demon who treated truth itself as something you could bend for personal advantage. And then, when the moment came to decide how his own story would end, he chose to stop telling it exactly when he felt it was finished, rather than let it run long enough to lose whatever made it worth telling in the first place. A story about the cost of secrets, ending its own run by refusing to keep one longer than it had to, that is not nothing. I do not think that is a coincidence. And I would call it one of the most honest pieces of authorship in the whole franchise, more honest, in its own way, than anything any character in Gravity Falls ever managed to do for another character on screen. It is strange, looking back across everything this essay has tried to track, how consistently every one of these philosophies keeps returning to the same handful of questions asked from different angles. Dipper, wanting to be believed. Mabel choosing joy on purpose because the alternative was letting the summer's ending win early. Stan lying for 30 years because the truth would have cost him the only family he had left. Ford chasing certainty until certainty nearly cost him the world. Soos loving without needing to be repaid for it. Wendy performing calm because calm was cheaper than admitting what scared her. Gideon and the Northwest's mistaking control for love. Pacifica learning, slowly and at real cost, that inherited belief is not the same thing as chosen belief. A whole chorus of smaller townspeople proving that most philosophies are not grand at all, just habits people settled into and never questioned. And above all of it, a triangle from outside reality itself, who spent 2 seasons convincing everyone he was the biggest thing in the room, only to admit in his very last breath that he was not, and who then spent years afterward as a genuine unknown, until a book finally let him say what he had actually believed the whole time. Gravity Falls ran for only 2 summers on screen, 40 episodes total, and it built around itself a famously dedicated amateur cryptography community, an entire audience that learned to read hidden ciphers in the credits, to treat every frame as a possible clue, to travel across real-world locations chasing a scavenger hunt built into Gravity Falls' own ending. That obsession with hidden meaning was never separate from the show's philosophy. It was the philosophy, acted out by the people watching it. A story about characters who spend their whole lives deciding what to reveal and what to protect. Ended up training its audience to do exactly the same thing, digging for the truth underneath the surface, patiently, for years, long after the network had moved on to other programming. That is a rare thing for any show to accomplish, and I think it is the reason this franchise still gets talked about with the kind of warmth usually reserved for something much older than it actually is. It only had 2 summers, and yet it remains one of those shows people describe as the summer of their childhood, whether or not they actually watched it as children. If you have made it this far tonight, I hope some of that warmth followed you through. Thank you for spending this time with Pine Hat. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.